Chayna's Torment. Chapter 20. Loquatus stood at the first private chamber at the head of a small group of Kabbalists and dignitaries. They had all been summoned in the wake of the raid, ostensibly to testify about their whereabouts and report on what they had seen. The Mayor Ambassador recognized a simple call for scapegoats, however. He was unconcerned for himself. His contact with Major Terror had been completely innocent, or at least absolutely secret. Even if the first knew he had been in contact with the Order, Loquatus felt secure. There was nothing in the content of his exchanges with Terror that was incriminating. If Terror read a hidden meaning into the ambassador's words, Loquatus could easily feign shock, and could well afford to make restitution. Besides, he was certain the first understood the political necessity of keeping in touch with one's enemies as well as one's allies, especially in these troubled times. The captain of the city watch standing next to him was not so confident. The man had the common earthy stink of fear all over him, and with good reason. The city's defences were virtually non-existent during the opening minutes of the raid, and so far no one had come up with an explanation of how the Order was able to penetrate so far into the city so quickly. There were even rumours that the captain had betrayed the Cabal and given the Order free access to the heart of the city. But Loquatus knew for a fact that they were false. He surreptitiously stepped further away from the captain. However, for his was the most likely head to fall. Next to the captain stood Chayna, the young Dementist who was going to provide a replacement for Turg. Chayna seemed calm, almost tranquil compared to the captain, but Loquatus was having a difficult time seeing into the boy's mind. Most of the individuals he encountered in person were defenseless as they had peepholes installed in their foreheads that Loquatus could peer into at any time. His mind was guarded by a tortured maze of mirrors. Every time Loquatus looked in, all he saw were distorted images of himself. The boy Chayna kept glancing to his right at Lush, a sallow Kabbalist who had just become the new master of the games. Lush's mind was more open than Chayna's and calmer than the captain's, but there was no useful information in it. It was full of facts and figures and deals and deadlines, all glued together with an acrid contempt for the almost all-sentient being. The first swept into the room with his attendants hovering all around him. The killers on the wall stood a little straighter as he passed them, and the entire entourage took up positions at the far end of the room. The first's mind was even more closed to Loquatus than Chayna's.
"I will be brief," the first said. "I am conducting a basic inquiry into the recent visit we received from the Crusade. Captain Fleer."
"Yes, Pater." Sweat fairly poured from Fleer's forehead.
"Explain the guard's poor performance."
"It was a well-organized attack," Fleer stammered. "They hit us on all three sides simultaneously." The first nodded to one of his hand attendants who was busily transcribing the captain's words.
"West, north, and south?"
"Yes, Pater."
"But not from the east, not from the sea?"
He looked to Loquatus meaningfully, but the ambassador kept his face and his thoughts blank. "No, Pater. There was no attack on the port of the docks."
"That you know of?"
No, Pater, that I know of."
"And yet, somehow an entire squadron of Crusade fanatics was able to gain access to the arena?"
"Yes, Pater."
"And storm the vault in an effort to seize the Mirari?"
"Yes, Pater."
"And you have no idea how they were able to get into the arena so quickly?"
"No, Pater. We killed or wounded hundreds," he added desperately. "They took heavy casualties in the retreat."
"Because they took almost none in the attack? Be silent, Captain."
The first turned his withering white gaze on Loquatus.
"Ambassador," he said, "I trust you were not inconvenienced by the attack."
"Not at all, O Patriarch. If not for the noise, I doubt I would have even known there was an attack."
"Outstanding. As you know, the comfort of our visitors is something we city dwellers pride ourselves on. We would never want to breach the sacred bond between host and guest."
"That bond is as strong as ever, my lord."
"You must understand, however, that these events will impact the plans we already made."
"Of course, my lord." Loquatus swallowed his first taste of uncertainty. "I trust it will not impact them too dramatically."
"That remains to be seen."
The first addressed Lush.
"Master of the games,"
he said, and Loquatus saw Chayna's mild surprise tinged with disappointment. Loquatus wasn't sure, but clearly Chaina had not been aware of Lucia's promotion.
Pater, your predecessor allowed the arena to be taken like some lonely mountain outpost. The pits are now in your hands. Will they be ready for the anniversary games?
Lucia's lips moved as he juggled figures in his head.
2 months, 3 weeks,
the first said. Luce nodded.
No problem. The damage to the facilities was mostly cosmetic. The crowds will be down for another few weeks because the spectators will be afraid of another raid. They'll forget, though. By the time the anniversary rolls around, everything will be back to normal. Outstanding! Be sure that the shills and runners know the date. I want that arena full. Yes, Pater.
The first now turned his milky gaze on Chaina. He smiled warmly.
Master Chaina, he said.
Pater. Chaina seemed completely at ease, almost disinterested.
Once again, the Cabal owes you its thanks. It's impossible to tell how much damage the Order would have done.
He glared at Fleer.
If you hadn't arrived in time to stop them.
I'm your obedient child.
That you are, but there should be more of a reward than my praise. Is there anything you desire? If it's within my power, it shall be yours.
I require nothing, Pater, Chaina said, though my friend and partner Kamal was gravely injured during the raid. He is not Cabal, yet he put his own body in harm's way on the Cabal's behalf.
Then your friend and partner also has my thanks. His wounds are being seen to.
They are, but if it pleases you, Pater, I have chosen my reward.
Name it.
Give me the Mirari, Chaina said, and Loquatus fought the urge to cry out. Not to keep, the young Dementus went on, but just to use on my friend.
I was unaware that the Mirari had healing powers,
the first said. Loquatus heard an element of suspicion in the Patriarch's voice, suspicion that Loquatus shared. How did the boy know something about the Mirari that neither Loquatus or the first knew? As far as I know, it doesn't. But the extent of my powers has to be defined. I would like to try and help my friend with the Mirari in my hands. Loquatus could no longer contain himself. No one yet has touched the Mirari and lived, he blurted. Chaina smiled. Except for me, Ambassador. And I only seek to borrow the Mirari, not to own it. The first paused, obviously deep in thought.
It shall be done, he said, although I shall accompany you to protect the Cabal's interests.
Of course, Pater. I should very much like to see the Mirari in the hands of an expert, Loquatus said. Twice now I have watched it destroy its temporary owners. Your presence is not necessary, Chaina said. Loquatus was preparing to argue when Chaina continued, addressing the first. Although I would also like to employ the Mirari as an aid in fulfilling our bargain with the Ambassador. I can provide him with a new familiar at any time, but with the Mirari in hand I can exceed his expectations. I have no objections to the Dementus proposal, Loquatus said quickly. The first was slower to respond.
Very well, he said, but one use of the Mirari is a reward. The second must be paid for.
Pater, I am always at your service. When shall the Mirari be employed on my behalf? Chaina and the first exchanged a knowing glance, then each nodded. Loquatus was beside himself that they were communicating right in front of him, and he had no idea what they were saying.
2 days hence,
the first said, and Chaina nodded again.
Now there is one final matter that I need to address.
He clapped his hands once, and the former master of the games was dragged, bound and kicking, into the chamber. She was gagged, but she continued to babble incoherently through the heavy cloth.
Kapow, be still.
The sound of her secret name drained all the energy out of the former master of the games. She stood dazed and listless, her eyes glassy and fearful. The first gestured, and one of his attendants stepped forward and slashed her bonds from her wrist and ankles. The former master of the game stood perfectly still, as if unaware of her new freedom. Loquatus stole a glance at Luce, who had just taken over the most dangerous position. For once, the bitter little man was not thinking about how much others annoyed him. In fact, Loquatus didn't need to read minds to understand the sickly, haunted look on Lucia's face.
Sagitt, step forward,
the first intoned, and Fleer woodenly took up the space next to the bound master.
You have failed, my children, the first said. But in the Cabal, failure is not punishable by death. Failure requires correction, not extinction. Your failures, however, have cost the Cabal too much. You will make amends for the lives and the materials wasted for your blundering.
The first spread his arms wide, and for once none of his attendants jumped forward to do his bidding. In fact, Loquatus thought even the near-mindless hand attendants were staying well clear of Fleer and the formerly bound woman.
I forgive you, my children, for your failure.
The first smiled at Loquatus and added,
My greatest flaw is a tendency to overindulge my family. I can never stay angry at them for long.
Loquatus smiled politely, but the Cabalists continued to writhe in horror before the first.
Kapow, Sagitt, accept your forgiveness and your Padder's love. Embrace me and settle your accounts so this matter can be forgotten.
Loquatus saw frenzied bolts of terror flash across Lucia's mind, and even Chaina seemed apprehensive. The merman was fascinated. He had never seen anyone so much as brush the sleeve of the first robe. He understood physical contact with the Patriarch was the Cabalists' only taboo, and yet two of them were being beckoned into the first arms by the man himself. The errant Cabalist stepped woodenly forward, shuffling like sleepwalkers. Tears of terror were streaming down Fleer's face, and the former master of the game seemed almost catatonic. They came forward, however, and stood perfectly still as the first wrapped them both in his long arms. As soon as the grey flesh of the first hands touched the squirming Cabalist, they began to scream. The first tightened his grip and locked his hands together with Fleer, and the deposed master held tight. Their skin blackened where he touched it. The patches of stricken skin spread like fire across a pool of oil, and fine tendrils of black smoke drifted from the victims into the first's waiting nostrils. The Cabal Patriarch tightened his grip again and threw his head back. The two figures in his arms were now scarcely recognizable as human. Instead, they seemed to be delicate, paper-thin flowers that were drooping, dying, and rotting all in a matter of seconds. The hollow, brittle rinds of two adult Cabalists collapsed into 1,000 fragments as the last of their essence was converted to ebon mist and absorbed by the first. Now, the first had grown larger, more robust.
All is truly forgiven.
He clapped his hands together, dislodging ashen fragments from his sleeves.
Chaina, he said, stay with me. The rest of you are dismissed with my thanks.
Loquatus followed Luce as the guards led them out and down the hallway. He would have to be especially careful now. In 2 days, he would be in the same room with the Mirari while Chaina employed it. Everyone else who tried to use the sphere died in a cataclysmic circumstance while the Mirari rolled free. If Chaina was going to destroy himself as Piana and Abishan had, Loquatus intended to make sure that this time, he was the one who caught the bouncing ball. While the others were led away, the first had his attendants hold up the documents for him to read. Nodding once for each when he was finished, the attendants made the first mark on the scrolls he approved, then took them away.
It was a terrible thing, the Crusade raid,
the first said. Chaina nodded.
Such a thing should not be allowed to happen again,
the first continued. Chaina nodded.
There were 100 Cabal fatalities and twice 100 injuries. But even more than the murder of our brethren, I want Major Terror and the other Heartlanders to pay for their arrogance. Do they think they can attack us in our own home and walk away with only a bloodied nose? They owe us restitution, and no one walks away from Cabal debt.
The first is wise.
You know what I'm going to ask you, don't you?
The first eyes were calming and wide. Yes, Pater.
And in return, you know I will grant you the second use of the Mirari.
Yes, Pater.
When can you leave?
Tonight, Pater. After I visited Kamal and tried my best to heal him, he was instrumental in my shikar. I can't leave him to the leeches. The first nodded.
What did you think of my demonstration?
Chaina paused. I think the ambassador either encouraged or enabled the raid. I think he still wants the Mirari. I think he intends to use it to take control of Mur, and then he'll come for Otaria.
He will try, the first agreed, but there is value in an ally with no morals. If he will betray us to the Order, he will in time betray the Order to us.
The first is wise.
Let us discuss the details of casting you have planned for him. I may be able to improve the overall result.
As soon as I return, Pater.
Outstanding. Now,
He thrust his hands deep into the sleeves of his robes.
let us attend your barbarian friend.